Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today I am joined by Ian Giatti, who has a great story, a really interesting story about this woman, Shelley Luther. Ian, how's it going today?
I'm doing well, Billy. How you doing?
I'm doing well. You know, this story is wild because I remember it happening during COVID, and then I lost track of it, but you caught up with Shelley Luther. Tell us a little bit, and I think people will remember the story when you refresh our memory, but tell us a little bit about Shelley.
Yeah, so Shelley first came to kind of national prominence. There were a bunch of news stories covering her. She basically defied the COVID-19 protocols here in Texas. She was a salon owner in Dallas who decided that, enough is enough. She shared with me in the interview that really she was having trouble paying her people. So she's not actually like a hairstylist herself, but she owned the property that, where these hairstylists rent space from. And so none of them were able to, make ends meet. Some were complaining they weren't eating because they couldn't feed their kids. And so she got to the point where she said, you know what, I'm going to reopen and I'm going to take a stand. And she did, and she made national headlines for it. So most people will recognize her from that. But what many may not know is that she actually ran for office following that whole series of events in 2020. She ran for two separate Texas legislator positions twice and came up short. And so she decided to make a third run. But the only reason she did is because she thought she was done with politics for good, made these two political runs that were unsuccessful, and then she had a medical emergency, which kind of turned everything around.
All right, there's so much there to unpack because the first piece of the puzzle, right, her decision to do, I mean, if you go back to COVID, what she did at that time was very countercultural because a lot of the narrative from the government was if you don't get the vaccine, you're killing people. If you don't do this, so to open up your business in the middle of COVID, at least among more progressive politicians and citizens, was seen as a dangerous thing to do. But you described a situation, I mean, and we all know people who went through this where there was no money. People didn't have food for their families. They weren't sure what they were going to do. They were panicked. And so she opens her salon up. She ends up going to jail, which is just crazy for a couple of days. I know it became a huge story. The governor of Texas intervened on her behalf. Did she give you any sense, just kind of focusing there, and then I want to get into her medical emergency, but did she give you any sense of the lessons she took away from that? Because it's a pretty bold move to take at a time when people were so judgmental of such a move.
Well, what she did is the way she put it into context for me anyway in our conversation was that there was nothing political here at all. That in fact, whatever your thoughts were on COVID protocols and the rules and across the state and the country, her whole thing was being able to allow those people who she rented her space to be able to provide for their families. It was as cut and dry as that. And the way she spoke about it was not, I'm not a hero or anything like that. I just knew what needed to be done. And I thought, there was a moment there in 2020 where people weren't really willing to hear that side of the story. But now when it's spoken of that way, it makes total sense, right? I mean, that's families have to provide, you have to provide for their family, their workers. And so she thinks of it more as a thing of, it was just a straightforward, natural move for her to make.
Well, what made her say, okay, because obviously she made 3 runs for office, the third one was successful. What was it that motivated that? Because that's very different from running a salon or, running an animal shelter, which I know she does now. Like what was it that made her say, "You know what? I want to be a politician."
Yeah, well, she ran for the Texas Senate in 2020 and she lost, and then in 2022 she ran for the Texas House and she also lost. Um, and at that time, what she told me was, okay, maybe this isn't for me. I think I'm just not going to be in politics anymore. She said she spoke, her and her husband discussed it, thought about it, prayed about it. She even said that what they came up with was that, maybe this isn't God's plan for us. And so in her mind, it was like, okay, let's go back to normal life. Um, and then in April 2023, she suffered a brain aneurysm. It left her in a coma and she was hospitalized for almost a month. And then she had to go, of course, after that, through months of speech and physical therapy. And it was there that she really talked about a a spiritual transformation. She said, I've always believed in God. I've always, been a Christian. But she's like, when I went through this medical emergency, everything changed. She has some really great comments about what it meant to survive a medical emergency versus her just just getting elected to office here in the last election. She said, honestly, God showed me that wasn't the biggest story. He's the biggest story, and she calls it a miracle that she's even alive. Forget running for a seat and then winning an election. And so I think like most people going through that, put all these other endeavors, even the 2020 debacle that she went through, into perspective, and she realized without her health and without the Lord, there's really not much else to talk about.
There's so much there to unpack spiritually too, because there are times that it is the end of the road for something we're trying to do, right? That God is saying that's not for you, but there are also times where those losses guide us to a place where we learn something valuable and there is still more in the journey. And for her, there was, right? It wasn't over. She ran that third time, she made it. But going through that health, scenario, obviously that brought her closer to her faith. One of the things that's interesting, obviously, somebody like Shelley, who's been arrested, gone through these issues for fighting for what she believes in, it makes you wonder, well, what is her platform, right? What is she going to stand for once she takes office? Did you get any sense of what that will be?
Yeah, well, she said, look, she ran as a Republican. She was elected as a Republican. So she said much of what I'll be focusing on will be Republican-led initiatives. Border security is going to be a big priority, obviously, here in Texas. But as you can imagine, another focus for her is going to be making sure that what happened during the COVID pandemic emergency isn't going to happen again, at least here in Texas. That she said that's going to be a focus. She doesn't want to see people have to go through what she went through and making the decision between keeping their business open and their livelihood going versus violating the law and getting in trouble and getting ultimately thrown in jail as she was. So that's going to be a focus for her legislatively, and I think she's going to attack that full bore.
All right. So, final question for you on this, because, when you're a reporter and you're getting to cover stories and dive in, an interview like this is interesting because it does force us, I think, as human beings to question, well, what would I have done? Would I have done the same thing knowing that maybe jail time would be on the table? Did this challenge you personally at all? What did you sort of walk away with from this interview, this discussion, and this story?
It's a really good question. I think what I learned from her was, I was expecting a certain kind of interview. I was expecting someone who's obviously smart, intelligent, politically defiant, and so maybe someone who's like, I didn't want to do what the government said, and she didn't. And kudos to her for that. But what I found was someone very different. Someone who was at one point in their walk um, with the Lord, and suddenly it goes to another level, not because of great things that happened, not because of blessing or success, but because of the total opposite, in fact. So not only am I referring to just the 2020, the arrest, the brief time in jail, those kind of things, but I'm also talking about the losses she suffered politically, and then to go through the health scare, where she basically said, I was pretty sure that was it. I really do believe, and I can speak to this personally. I'm sure many people listening can speak to the same thing. That's really where the rubber meets the road for many people, and you can tell this event was a dividing line for her, where she realized, oh, absolutely, these things are important. I want to stand up for what I believe politically and all that. But the most important thing for me is my relationship with God, where I stand with Him, and the rest will kind of take care of itself. And I found that to be very surprising. And I thought that was something that all of us can kind of learn from. It's not just these political successes or maybe these small things here and there where we think are victories. It's this transformation of the heart and of the mind to a kind of new way of living. That was her big thing. That's what she was celebrating. And I think she's going to take that into the Texas Legislature.
Well, that is a great place for us to close, and people can read your interview and your story in the show notes. Ian, as always, appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post and come back next week for another episode of The Inside Story. We'll see you then.